I thought we had a fresh start, but she had a secret. Mark had always considered himself a lucky man. Married to Ashley, the woman of his dreams, he felt like he had it all. They were the quintessential couple, inseparable since college, with an effortless connection that others envied. Everyone who knew them thought they were the perfect match. Mark had a solid career, a supportive circle of friends, and a beautiful home where he and Ashley had built a life together. There were no complaints, no cracks in their relationship, just pure happiness, or so he thought. Their love story was one of those stories people shared over drinks, always with a smile. Mark had always been the one to make Ashley laugh. She had this infectious energy, a spark that brightened any room. They complemented each other perfectly. He was steady, a little reserved, while she was lively, always chasing after the next adventure. It felt like they were meant to be. Then came the decision to move to a new city. Mark had just received a fantastic job offer, one that would push his career forward, and Ashley, ever the optimist, was eager for a change of scenery. They'd both lived in their small town for years and felt the need to start fresh. A new chapter, they thought. A place where they could grow both individually and as a couple. It seemed like the perfect opportunity. At first, everything fell into place seamlessly. The new city was vibrant, with endless possibilities. Ashley thrived in the unfamiliar environment. She joined local groups, made new friends, and threw herself into the experience. Mark was just as excited. His new job was challenging, but he felt a sense of purpose. They were building something new, creating a life in this bustling new place. In the beginning, things felt better than ever. They enjoyed exploring together, finding new favorite restaurants and spots in the city. Their weekends were filled with trips to farmers' markets, long walks in the park, and movie nights. It was a fresh start, one that made Mark believe their relationship would continue to deepen. But it wasn't long before small changes began to creep in. Ashley, once always by his side, seemed to be spending more time on her own. She'd disappear for a few hours here and there, often claiming she was running errands or meeting up with new friends she'd made in the city. Mark didn't think much of it at first. She was adjusting, and maybe she needed a bit of space. After all, this new city was full of possibilities for her too. But with each passing week, the changes were becoming harder to ignore. Mark began to notice that the time they spent together was becoming less and less. He found himself spending more nights alone, scrolling through his phone, wondering when he would hear from her next. Conversations became shorter, and Ashley seemed distant, preoccupied with something he couldn't quite put his finger on. One evening, while they were having dinner, Mark noticed something else. Ashley's attention was elsewhere. Her phone buzzed every few minutes, and her gaze kept drifting to it. She didn't mention it, just swiped away the notifications without a second thought. Something about it felt off. The air between them had shifted in a way Mark couldn't explain. He had been so focused on building their new life together that he hadn't seen it happening. He hadn't seen her pulling away. That night, as Mark lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something was wrong. He wanted to believe it was just his imagination running wild, but the doubt was already there. He turned over, facing Ashley as she slept soundly beside him, unaware of the questions that had begun to gnaw at him. The foundation of their seemingly perfect life had begun to crack. And soon, Mark would learn that the cracks were deeper than he ever imagined. It wasn't long before Mark's suspicions grew harder to ignore. At first, it had been nothing more than a vague feeling, a slight shift in the air. But now, it was more than that. It was tangible. Ashley was acting different. Mark could sense it in the way she moved through their shared space, more distracted, more distant. She wasn't as engaged with him as she used to be. Their conversations had become surface level, and those moments of closeness that used to feel effortless now seemed forced. He'd catch her staring off into space, or, worse, her attention would drift to her phone. She'd get up to check it, leaving him in the middle of a sentence, only to come back moments later with a vague excuse. She'd say she was checking in on some new friends she'd made, or that she'd just gotten caught up with work. But Mark couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something more was going on. It wasn't just the small things either. Mark began noticing that Ashley was spending more and more time out of the house, going places she hadn't mentioned or meeting up with people he'd never heard of. Sometimes, she'd come home late, with no real explanation. At first, Mark told himself it was normal, she was adjusting to the new city, making friends, finding her place. But the longer this went on, the more he felt like an outsider in his own home. One evening, he asked her about her day as they sat down to dinner. The question felt routine, but this time, Ashley's response was a bit off. She gave him a vague answer, then quickly shifted the topic, almost as if she were trying to avoid something. Mark's gaze lingered on her as she spoke, noticing how she seemed to fidget with her phone, distracted in a way he had never seen before. The phone wasn't just a device now, it was a barrier, a constant presence that kept her just out of reach. The next morning, Mark was brushing his teeth when he saw Ashley's phone on the counter. It was unlocked, something that rarely happened, as she usually kept it under lock and key. His heart started to race, but he forced himself to turn away. He wasn't the type to snoop, and he knew trust was the foundation of any relationship. But as the seconds passed, that nagging voice inside him grew louder. What was she hiding? The phone buzzed on the counter. Mark looked at it, the sound slicing through the quiet morning like a knife. He took a deep breath and looked over his shoulder. Ashley was still in the shower, oblivious to the temptation that lay just inches away. Mark's fingers hovered over the screen, his instincts screaming at him to look, to know the truth. He told himself it was wrong, that he shouldn't invade her privacy. But the fear that gripped him was stronger than his morals. Finally, he picked up the phone. His heart pounded in his chest as he glanced down at the screen. There was a new message. I miss you so much. I can't wait to see you again. The words hit him like a punch in the stomach. He didn't know what he was expecting, but it wasn't this. Mark stared at the message for a long time, his hands trembling as he set the phone back down. He tried to convince himself that he was overreacting, that it could be some innocent message. But deep down, he knew better. The feeling in his gut was too strong. The message wasn't innocent, it was intimate, personal. As Ashley finished in the shower, Mark's mind raced. Who was this person? Why was she keeping this from him? What had happened to the trust they once shared? The rest of the day was a blur. Mark went through the motions, pretending everything was fine, but inside, the walls of his perfect world were crumbling. He couldn't shake the thought of that message. He needed answers. He needed to confront Ashley, to understand what was going on. But for now, all he could do was wait. Mark couldn't sit still. The message he had read on Ashley's phone had gnawed at him relentlessly. Every moment of the day was clouded by the weight of that one simple sentence, I miss you so much. I can't wait to see you again. The words swirled in his mind like a hurricane, each turn spinning him further into a storm of doubt and hurt. That evening, Mark had planned to go out with his coworkers, but the thought of being away from Ashley, of not confronting the truth, was unbearable. He sat at his desk, staring at his phone, scrolling through emails he didn't care about, trying to distract himself. But nothing worked. He couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Then, as the minutes dragged on, his phone buzzed. A message from Ashley. Hey, I'm meeting a friend for drinks tonight. Don't wait up. It was so casual, almost too casual. She didn't even mention the name of the friend, which was odd. Mark had met most of the people Ashley had been hanging out with since the move, but there were still a few unfamiliar faces. This was different, though. It wasn't like her to be so vague. The voice inside him, the one that had been whispering doubt for weeks, grew louder. Something about the way she'd said it, the lack of detail, sent chills down his spine. Mark wasn't usually the type to doubt Ashley. In their years together, he'd always trusted her completely. But now, everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers. He had to know what was going on. He had to find out where she was going and who this friend was. Mark told himself it was just a quick check, a simple thing, nothing more than confirming his suspicions or putting his mind at ease. He grabbed his jacket and slipped out of the apartment before Ashley could see him. As he stepped into the elevator, his thoughts were racing. Was this really the moment? Was he about to cross a line that would forever change everything? The city was bustling as he followed the route Ashley had taken. He kept a safe distance, careful not to be noticed. He couldn't shake the feeling of guilt, but it was quickly overridden by the hunger for the truth. His heart beat faster with every step, every block he covered. When he reached the bar, he saw Ashley standing outside, laughing and chatting with a man Mark didn't recognize. It only took a second for his heart to drop. He didn't know this man, but something about the familiarity between them, the way Ashley's eyes lit up as she smiled at him, made Mark's stomach turn. The affection between them was obvious. This wasn't just a casual meeting between friends. It was something more. The man leaned in, brushing Ashley's cheek with his hand, and Mark felt the breath leave his body. The ache in his chest was sharp, painful. He had never felt this kind of betrayal before, not even in his darkest moments. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. But there was no making sense of it. For a few moments, Mark just stood there, unable to move, unable to think. The couple of seconds that felt like hours. He saw Ashley's hand gently touch the man's arm, and it became painfully clear this wasn't just friendship. It was something else. Something that had been happening behind his back, in a place he couldn't see, hidden away from him. The man kissed her cheek as they entered the bar, laughing together, completely unaware of the storm Mark was now in. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to leave. He turned on his heels and walked quickly, his mind spinning in 100 different directions. He felt sick, betrayed, broken, but most of all, he felt humiliated. This wasn't supposed to be his life. Not after everything they'd been through. When he got back home, the apartment was quiet. Ashley was still out. Mark paced back and forth, trying to gather his thoughts, to figure out what to say. How could he confront her? What would he say? There were no words that would make this easier. He could already hear the excuses, the apologies that would follow. But nothing could undo the fact that she had chosen someone else. When Ashley finally came in, hours later, Mark was sitting in the dark living room, waiting. His mind was no longer in a state of confusion, he was clear, determined, but also utterly crushed. Ashley stepped through the door, smiling, but her expression faltered when she saw Mark's face. The smile she'd worn earlier was gone. "Mark?" Her voice was soft, uncertain. She didn't even need to ask what was wrong. Mark could see it in her eyes that she knew he knew. "Who is he?" Mark asked quietly, his voice steady but filled with hurt. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The words spoke louder than any scream could. Ashley opened her mouth to say something, but the words didn't come. "Who is he?" Mark repeated. The silence between them stretched out, thick and painful. Ashley looked away, guilt flashing across her face. "Mark, I didn't mean for this to happen." "Didn't mean for this to happen?" Mark's voice cracked. "Ashley, you've been lying to me. You've been seeing him behind my back." Tears welled up in Ashley's eyes, and for the first time, Mark saw the rawness of her guilt. But it wasn't enough. Nothing could undo the betrayal that had just shattered everything between them. The room felt cold, despite the warmth of the city creeping in through the windows. Mark sat on the couch, his gaze fixed on Ashley as she stood in the doorway, hesitant and broken. There was a heaviness in the air, a palpable tension that seemed to grow with every passing second. The life they had once shared, filled with laughter and love, now felt like a distant memory, a mirage fading under the weight of reality. Ashley opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. She wrung her hands together, her fingers trembling. Mark had seen Ashley upset before, he'd seen her anxious, nervous, even angry, but never like this. This was different. This was guilt, pure and raw. "Mark, I'm so sorry," she finally whispered, her voice small and fragile. The words felt like an echo, hollow and unconvincing. She took a tentative step forward, then another, but Mark remained still, his eyes never leaving hers. His chest tightened, a knot of anguish tightening around his heart. "You're sorry?" Mark's voice was barely audible, but it was steady, controlled. "How do you think I feel, Ashley? How long has this been going on?" Ashley swallowed hard, the lump in her throat obvious. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry, she was too exhausted, too broken for that. Instead, she stood there, fighting the torrent of emotions that threatened to spill over. I didn't want to hurt you, she began, her voice shaking. It started so slowly. At first, it was nothing. Just a friendship. But then it turned into something more, and I didn't know how to stop it. I thought I could hide it, but it got too deep. I never meant for you to find out like this. Mark's breath hitched in his chest. The truth, though it wasn't fully revealed yet, was already more than he could bear. He had hoped, prayed, that there was some mistake, that it was all a misunderstanding, but now that she was standing in front of him, admitting what he had feared all along, there was no denying it. Who is he? Mark asked again, the question now slipping from his lips with more force. He needed to hear it. He needed to know the name, the face of the man who had been a part of their life in ways Mark hadn't even imagined. Ashley hesitated for a moment before answering, a flicker of shame crossing her features. His name is David. He's someone I met back home before we moved. We'd kept in touch, and when we moved here, we started seeing each other. I know it was wrong, but it just happened. Mark shook his head in disbelief. You were seeing him before we even left our old town, weren't you? The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The distance between them hadn't stopped Ashley. If anything, it had made her more creative, more careful. More deceitful. I didn't mean for it to happen, Ashley said, the guilt weighing heavily on her voice. I was so focused on starting over here, on making a new life for us, but I couldn't stop myself. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could have both. She stopped, choking on her words. But I was wrong. I betrayed you, Mark. I'd betrayed everything we built together. And I'm so sorry. Mark didn't know how to respond. The words she was saying, the apology that felt so hollow, didn't feel like enough. They never would be. There was no easy way out of this, no amount of remorse could erase the hurt she had caused. She had taken something sacred, something they had fought to create, and she had broken it into 1,000 pieces. I thought we had a fresh start, Ashley, Mark whispered, the ache in his chest palpable. I thought we were building something new together. But I was wrong. You were still holding on to your past. You were still holding on to him. Ashley's shoulders sagged as she looked down, tears streaming down her face. I was selfish, she murmured, barely audible. I didn't know how to let go of him. But I see now that I've lost everything that mattered. Mark stood up, the pain in his chest intensifying. And what about me, Ashley? What about us? Did that mean nothing? I love you, Mark. I do, she cried, her voice breaking. But I wasn't being honest. Not with you, not with myself. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. I want to make it right. Please. Please forgive me. Mark took a step back, his hand pressing against his forehead. He wanted to believe her, he really did. He wanted to hear that things could be fixed, that their love could be salvaged. But the truth was, everything had changed. Trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild. And even if he wanted to forgive her, could he? Could he ever look at her the same way again? He was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing. There was no rush to answer her. There was no rush to decide if he could move forward. The pain was too fresh, too sharp. It would take time, too much time, to even begin to process everything. Finally, Mark spoke, his voice steady but carrying the weight of everything he was feeling. I don't know if I can forgive you, Ashley. Not right now. Maybe not ever. Ashley crumpled in on herself, her face etched with regret. She had no response to that. There was nothing left to say. And in the silence that followed, Mark realized just how much had changed. How much he had lost. The days that followed felt like an endless fog to Mark. His heart, which had once been so sure of its path, was now adrift in a sea of confusion, anger, and sorrow. It was as though the world had stopped, frozen in the wake of the conversation he and Ashley had shared. Everything had changed, and Mark had no idea how to proceed. He spent the next few days trying to live as if nothing had happened. It was a lie, of course, but the alternative, sitting in the pain of his reality, felt too much to bear. He went through the motions, showing up to work with a forced smile, going to the gym, pretending everything was normal. But inside, he was breaking. Ashley, too, seemed to be living in the shadow of the truth. They barely spoke. Mark had been clear with her, he needed time, space to process everything. Ashley respected that, but it was a quiet sort of respect, the kind that could not undo the damage already done. She tried to reach out, tried to apologize, but Mark could never quite bring himself to look her in the eye for too long. When she touched his arm or tried to make conversation, his skin recoiled as if the very touch of her was foreign now. It was a cruel irony, they had left their old life behind for a fresh start, only to find that what they were running from was already inside them. Mark couldn't help but feel that everything had been a lie, that the woman he thought he knew was someone else entirely, someone he would never truly understand. One evening, after days of silence, Ashley came to him again. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes searching his face. Mark, unable to escape the confrontation any longer, set his coffee mug down, bracing himself. "I'm sorry, Mark. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending like everything's fine when it's not," Ashley said, her voice breaking the silence that had stretched between them like a tightrope. Mark didn't respond at first. He could see the pain in her eyes, but it felt so far away. She had broken his trust, and there was no easy way back from that. "Ashley, Mark's voice trailed off, the words stuck in his throat. What could he say? Could he tell her that he loved her still, despite the hurt? Could he forgive her, knowing that the betrayal would linger, even in their happiest moments? He wasn't sure. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. Ashley took a deep breath, her lips trembling. "I've been thinking a lot about what we had. And I see now that I've destroyed it. But I need to know, is there any part of you that still wants to fight for us?" The question hung in the air, its weight suffocating. Mark closed his eyes for a moment, forcing himself to think beyond the hurt. Could he fight for their relationship? Could he look past the broken promises and the lies to rebuild what they once had? The thought of rebuilding seemed like a mountain too steep to climb. His mind screamed at him to walk away, to stop wasting time and move forward without her. But the truth was, a part of him still loved Ashley. A part of him still wanted to believe that they could go back to the way things were. But another part of him knew that they could never go back. They couldn't erase the past. "I don't know," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can do that, Ashley. I don't know if I can trust you again. You've shattered something inside of me that I don't think will ever heal." Ashley's face crumpled as she absorbed his words. She was silent for a long moment, before she finally spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't blame you for that. I've hurt you in ways I can't take back. I know I've destroyed something beautiful. But I need you to know, Mark, that I love you. I always have." Mark's chest tightened at the words, but he didn't feel the same sense of comfort he once would have. Love, in this moment, felt like an empty promise. He sighed and stood up, walking toward the window. The city lights twinkled in the distance, but everything seemed distant, blurry. "I need to be alone for a while," Mark said, his back still to her. "I need to figure out what I want. I can't keep living like this." Ashley nodded silently, her face pale with grief. She knew that this was the beginning of the end, even if neither of them was ready to admit it fully. She stood up, hesitated for a moment as if to say something else, but she didn't. She just walked away, leaving Mark standing by the window, feeling like a stranger in his own life. The following days were a blur. Mark withdrew even further into himself, retreating from the world around him. He stopped pretending. He stopped forcing himself to smile, to keep up appearances. He didn't call his friends. He didn't go out. He spent hours staring at the walls, consumed by his own thoughts, trying to make sense of the wreckage of his life. Eventually, it became clear to him that their relationship was over, and no amount of time or effort could put the pieces back together. Trust, once shattered, was something that could never be fully restored. There was no going back to who they had been, no resetting the clock to a time before the betrayal. It was gone. And so, for the first time in years, Mark faced the reality of moving on. It was time to let go. The weeks that followed were painful, but they brought with them a quiet clarity that Mark hadn't anticipated. The apartment, once filled with the sounds of shared laughter and simple moments, now felt too big, too empty. It was a hollow echo of the life he had once imagined. But it was also a space for healing, for change, for him to rediscover himself. Ashley moved out shortly after their final conversation. She tried to apologize again, to beg for another chance, but Mark remained firm. He knew that no matter how much he still loved her, he could never go back to what they had. That version of their relationship was gone. And though it hurt deeply, Mark understood now that he had to let go of the past in order to move forward. In the quiet solitude of his apartment, Mark slowly began to rebuild. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the memories of Ashley would overwhelm him, and he would find himself drifting into old patterns of thinking, wondering if he had missed the signs, if he could have done something differently. But each time, he reminded himself that he wasn't to blame. Her actions were hers alone. One evening, as he sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the city below, Mark realized how much he had grown. The man he was a few months ago, the one who had believed that love was the ultimate answer, that trust was invincible, had been broken by betrayal. But through that fracture, something stronger had emerged. He wasn't the same person anymore, and that was okay. Mark started to rediscover parts of himself that he had forgotten in the years of devotion to Ashley. He reconnected with old friends, spent more time on his passions, and began taking care of himself in ways he hadn't in a long time. Slowly, his confidence returned, piece by piece. He was still healing, but he was learning to be whole again on his own. One afternoon, he ran into Sarah, an old friend from college, at a local cafe. They exchanged pleasantries, and though there was an awkwardness at first, as Sarah knew about the end of his relationship with Ashley, it wasn't long before the conversation turned to lighter subjects. By the end of their coffee, they were laughing, and Mark felt a spark of something he hadn't in a long time, hope. Sarah didn't push. She didn't try to fill the void left by Ashley. But there was something comforting about being in someone's company again, someone who cared but didn't carry the weight of the past. It reminded him that life, even after the most devastating betrayals, had a way of moving forward, whether we were ready or not. In the quiet moments, Mark still missed Ashley. The person he had loved, the person she had once been, still lingered in his mind. But the person who had betrayed him, who had chosen someone else over him, was a stranger. And as he let go of that memory, it became easier to see the path ahead, the one that didn't require her. The one that allowed him to finally be free. One evening, as he sat on the balcony watching the sunset, Mark realized something important. Healing wasn't about forgetting the past or erasing the pain. It was about accepting it. It was about acknowledging the hurt, understanding the lessons it had brought him, and using that to build something better for himself. In that moment, Mark smiled. For the first time in a long time, it wasn't a smile laced with sadness or regret. It was a smile that held hope. Hope for the future. Hope for love, yes, but most importantly, hope for himself. Mark's journey wasn't easy. Healing rarely is. But as the months passed, he found that time did, indeed, heal wounds, if not completely, then enough to move forward. He began to trust again, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And when he finally felt ready, he opened his heart to new possibilities, to new connections, and to new love. Life went on, as it always does, and Mark was finally at peace. Thank you for following Mark's journey through betrayal, heartbreak, and healing. It's a reminder that while pain can shape us, it doesn't have to define us. Trust and respect are the cornerstones of any relationship, and sometimes, the hardest lessons teach us the most important truths about who we are and what we deserve. If you enjoyed the story, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Share your thoughts and stories below. Let's support each other as we all strive to grow and move forward. Remember, you deserve honesty, love, and respect in every relationship you have. Until next time.